So welcome everyone, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for this discussion today. For those of you who have read the bios of these esteemed panelists sitting next to me, I think you'll agree with me that we have something of a dream team today on this particular topic. So I'm very excited, I hope you are as well, to hear sort of the discussion, and based on the sort of pre-calls that we've had, I can vouch for them by saying this will be a lively and fun discussion and very interesting. So I'm thrilled to be here myself. You know, I was sitting in the keynote session that Bill Gates gave and the discussion with Deborah afterwards, and one of the things that Bill was talking about was the slow pace of change when it comes to technology and education. And it struck me as I was walking over here and I was thinking about it that the first panel discussion that I ever participated in on education technology and how technology was going to revolutionize education was 25 years ago. So if this is a revolution, it's a very slow motion revolution.
You look great.
But you know, today there's a lot of excitement over some big new trends in technology. We've been talking a lot in the last couple of years, obviously, about big data and analytics. A lot of talk, obviously, at this conference about personalization, adaptive technologies. Certainly a lot of excitement over advances in machine learning, cognitive computing, robotics, VR, et cetera. And so what I'm curious about, and I'd like to actually hear from each of you, maybe we'll start at the end with John and then sort of come over this way, is what is your vision today of the impact that these technologies can and hopefully will have on education? It is are we really on the cusp of the revolution, and will it be driven by these new technologies? And if so, what does it look like? What is the core sort of value that it's going to deliver to the education and to learners? So John, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, you know, first of all, I think we need to take it what the fundamental problem is. And I you know, had a long dinner with Todd Rose last night, and I think he's really identified, you know, a fundamental flaw that's in our system. I have a slide that I use in my presentations, which is the distribution of reading skills and math skills of a 5th grade class in Chicago, Illinois. And you have kids that are reading at the 1st grade level, and you have kids that are reading the 8th grade level. And the challenge, obviously, for the teacher is there's not enough hours in the week to find the appropriate learning activity to deliver to those students. So to me, the challenge is eventually is how technology will respond to that challenge. It's a fundamental flaw in our system that I don't care how much money we throw at education, until we can meet the needs of each individual, we're teaching to the average. Mm-hmm. I think the two other challenges is one is the cultural challenge within schools. You know, things have to change. You know, at Apple we look at change as 3 different types of people. There's the swimmers that jump immediately in, then there's the shark spotters who wait to see if anything happens to those swimmers, and then there's the tent pole huggers who never move. And so you have a huge, you know, to me, it's bigger than an educational challenge. It's almost a cultural challenge, I believe. And in the past, we've tended to use technology as a substitution for what we already could do, rather than to empower an outcome in the classroom that could not be done without that technology.
And do you think that the ed tech market is beginning to understand that? Because that was an important point you made at the end, that the emphasis is less on, I mean, some of us talked on the phone call prior to this that we actually hated the title of this session, RoboEd, yeah, because it suggested somehow that we were going to replace sort of the key sort of features of teaching and learning, and in particular the teacher. Do you think, John, that sort of the market and the suppliers sort of understand that this is really about supplying tools that empower teachers to teach better?
I think it's really about an environment. I think all too often the focus is on the device rather than how the device works in an overall ecosystem. We have a pedagogy in the classroom today that's based on consumption and memorization. We need a pedagogy that's relevant, that's creative, that's collaborative, and that's challenging. And I think there's been great technology out there. I mean, Carnegie Learning did some pretty impressive stuff with math. But to make that transformation into a classroom where our teachers are already overwhelmed with, you know, with what they're already doing, you know, there's a chasm there that I think not only technology, but there's a cultural change that needs to take place.
David, John talked a lot about or started out his remarks by talking about the incredible sort of breadth of learners that we have and learning ability and knowledge that we have in today's classrooms. And that's true in higher ed as well as in K-12. It's true in professional learning settings. It's true around the globe. Obviously, Knewton is very focused on, sort of, and this is a topic we'll get into much more, but how you really target learning, how you differentiate, how you personalize it. What's your vision for how these technologies can really change teaching and learning?
Well, our view and my view is that technology, if not in service of people, if it doesn't work for people, if it's not working to improve how teachers teach and how students learn, it's just cool technology. And I think in the early days of if you want to call it ed tech or any of the industries that have been transformed by technology, you do see a lot of people coming in and creating technology, and their kind of tagline is, well, it's really cool. It can do these things. Let me tell you about all these features. And it really isn't about that. It's about solving the problems that are, and you were talking about this, that are happening in the classroom. We happen to have a thesis, and I happen to have a thesis around personalizing or individualizing learning. It sounds like a good thing. I think that's been our mission for a long time, and that's been great. But why do we care about that? Mm-hmm. And ultimately, we identify with allowing each individual student and instructor to be able to do their best, to be able to achieve their learning or teaching potential. And when you do that, amazing things happen in the classroom. Amazing things happen after the classroom. We were talking in another panel about China and about what's happening in China in education and technology. And people were talking about how culturally, how those differences manifest themselves into the industry. And one thing I noted was that there's a study that was done, or a survey that was done, talking about the major developed countries and their attitudes towards education and teaching specifically. Mm-hmm. And they ranked everyone's attitude, and teaching in China is on par with being a doctor in terms of its prestige. Teaching in the United States is on par with being a librarian. No offense to our librarians, but the chasm by which the cultural change that we need to have around supporting this industry with technology so that it solves real-world problems, that's really the key. It's not about a feature list of things that we could do. And so we're all about trying to enable and work with partners, big and small, to make sure that everyone can achieve their potential. Mm-hmm. And everyone has a different potential.
Mike, obviously IBM has been involved in education for a very, very long time, and applications of technology in education. You've probably seen more than most everyone in this room in terms of how your technology has been deployed in districts around the country, really around the world, with universities and so on. Do you share John and David's perspective that this is really a cultural issue more than a technological issue? And beyond that, how can the technology help to drive the cultural transformation faster, maybe?
No, I absolutely agree, and as David said, it's about people. And I use one of the things that we've been doing recently is a program we launched called PTech, or Pathways to Technology, and we started at a Brooklyn high school, which was really, students not completing high school. We came in, helped reshape the curriculum, gave them employee mentors, and offered to give them jobs at the back end of this. And so we've hired some people, a lot of these students, more than 50% going on to 4-year degrees after they complete their 2-year CUNY degree, and there really isn't any technology there. It's about in my mind, it's really about helping a student somewhere create an aspiration, engaging them in the learning process and giving them clarity on what to learn, and kind of helping them, ensuring that they're learning along the way and giving them confidence in themselves. And that can or can't use technology. And I think PTech's an example of something there's no technology there. Now, what technology can do is begin to scale those things. Yeah. And I think that's where I'm excited, and you see what's happening at this conference, and has happened. I've been coming here since it started with a couple hundred people, and so to see the community and the energy around this, what I see beginning to happen are things where we can begin to create almost an ecosystem for these students, to surround them with scalable technologies where it's not my stuff or Anthony's stuff, but we're working around industry standards that are emerging in this space. We can kind of provide clients security in their investment. And I used to sit on a lot of these panels and say it was not uncommon for me to see institutions spend tens of millions of dollars getting their payroll systems in place. but they didn't spend tens of millions of dollars on transforming their classrooms. But I think that's changing now. There's confidence in the investment that there's going to be an educational return on it. I think we're seeing lots of good proof points in places where we can really see that impact in the lives of students by scaling some of these good ideas.
Anthony, what's your perspective?
Well, I guess this is not appropriate, but I'm going to challenge your initial point with regards to
I can always trust Anthony to mix it up. Go for it.
Well, I think as it relates to us in the technology industry, everyone in this room, is not happening fast enough, sure. But if you think about human history and the pace of change that's actually happened into how people learn, there's been rapid progress in that. The challenge is the schools are struggling to catch up and actually doing it in many ways the wrong way. But how people learn is different. Access to information is global. It's abundant. The boundaries of what you can learn from what perspective, what gender, what religion has changed. You used to have to learn based on limited sets of materials or books or people, and that's fundamentally changed. That's huge. The challenge we have is schools recognize that change outside of the institutions and are catching up in many ways in the wrong way, valuing the device and the transition, the automation, versus the people journey, getting the culture ready to understand what that means, getting teachers to embrace a world that learning is actually happening outside of their touch and reach. And that challenge has been frustrating. And we've been applying different technology changes to it, but not really recognizing that core learning shift that we need to optimize, because that's where the heart of this change is. And I think that's happened fairly quickly. Schools have struggled to catch up, often doing the wrong things. And as everyone said, it's about the people. It's about the people journey for teachers and school leaders, the culture within inside schools. But I feel good about that. Now, that said, it's not happening fast enough. And it's not happening with the urgency and the thought there. But what that means is an embrace of how the school system, the learning environments, can absolutely amplify and become a catalyst to accelerate the ability to learn outside of the school. I think in many ways they've been trying to duplicate that life learning shift that's happening outside the school in technology-centric ways.
So let me follow up on that, because I think you raise a really interesting point, which is that maybe this is less about education versus non-education, and maybe this is more about large-scale educational institutions and systems versus consumers who seem to be able to change and pivot and shift and evolve faster.
I think if all of us do presentations, et cetera, how many people get out and take their cell phones out? In any monumental event in someone's life, they're capturing it, recording it, sharing it, et cetera. That's the way people learn. They're constantly making and creating and sharing and collaborating. That happens naturally in our world. And that environment is not present in our schools as pervasive as we need to. Simple. Learning has changed. Our schools have not. And how do we create schools that become hubs for that new learning dynamic is really what the journey I think that all of us are on, where we're fighting, where we're struggling to make that change happen faster. We see it. I don't think that you would feel as badly about the pace of change if you didn't see examples in our schools where the change has actually happened. Challenges happens in individual classrooms with amazing teachers that figure it out, maybe a school leader that makes it happen across the schools, but we know it's not broadly available and not readily available.
And that's where the frustration comes from.
Exactly.
Is the delta. It's a great point. Eric, obviously, this is a point that you probably have quite a bit of perspective on, given sort of the academic roots of Acrobatiq, and also the fact that much of what you're trying to do is to put tools in the hands of educators and as well as students to transform their practice. So curious your response to the panelists so far.
Yeah, I think I'll pick up on a thread that you raised, which is that we do know a lot about how people learn. And I think the challenge is that if you went around and you visited every classroom and you asked yourself, how frequently am I seeing the known practices that have substantial bodies of evidence supporting that these are effective practices in play? The answer would be not that often. And I think that that's the opportunity. And I think there is an interplay between the product and the practice here that has to happen. But I do think that what I think of as the really big opportunity is to start to think about these technologies as enablers. But they are truly, personalization of learning is a practice. It is not a product. It is an instructional practice that, if thought of that way, a teacher a faculty member can own it, right? They can say, I can own this. But what's tough right now is they don't really have, what does that mean? And I think we can make it more understood by giving them tools, that help them leverage it, harness it, know what it is, and take advantage of it. And it's that combination of the practice and the product that I think is going to move us forward much faster and at more scale. So I just think about a simple analogy of, not that long ago, if you wanted to leverage the power of computer code, you had to pretty much you had to understand computer code. Then operating systems come along, and they sort of build a layer on top of that, and they harness the power of that computer code for non-coders. I think we can harness the power of learning science and what we know through a sort of operating system on top of that, and put it in the hands of teachers, and then make sure that we in the industry as technologists are not promoting this idea that this is a product and you can adopt it and it's going to solve problems, but you can adopt it and you can use it to change your practice and take advantage of what's possible.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a bunch about your shared vision of being able to address a really differentiated population of learners, putting tools and really the best of learning science, data, technology into hands of practitioners in a way that is not impossible for them to navigate and to leverage, to drive real outcomes in the classroom, to sort of change the culture of education, and to change the way that schools and institutions leverage these capabilities to be successful. I want to talk a little bit more about, and we touched on it earlier, but what are really the specific obstacles to achieving that vision? What are the limiting factors? I mean, is it about cost at this point? Is it about training and capacity and change management? Is it about just institutional inertia, or is it more about societal concerns that that a data-driven robo-education is going to not protect the privacy of our students, of our learners and students? And what are the fundamental sort of obstacles to achieving the vision? And Mike, maybe I'll start with you, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, I think there are several obstacles, starting with the culture of a lot of these large institutions. That these are massive change management problems, and education is slow to change. The culture's very robust, understandably. I think that institutions struggle with, one, the investment required to make these kind of changes, because it's not just the technology, it is how do you upgrade the people, change the way they work and think. So there are a lot of factors that as organizations they have to wrestle with. And I think one of the things that we're taking to this is trying to think about this from the student's perspective as well. I thought about Jim Collins' comments around the 20-mile march, and ultimately we're really supporting these students on their 20-mile march through their lifelong education, and it starts in early childhood and it moves through K-12, it moves through higher education, and yet we really fixate so much on these institutions and how do we solve the institutional problem. I think there's a tremendous opportunity if we can think about the student.
John, I saw you were trying to get in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, kind of where do you start? I mean, first of all, I tend to make I'm writing a book on rewiring education based on 10 years running a K-12 school and teaching at Berkeley and Cal State, and obviously the last 14 years, traveling around the world. And I tend to agree. I make a distinction between education and learning. Okay, education to me is a noun, it's a process, it's a pretty well-defined pathway, and I talk about 3 dimensions in learning. There's the content, there's the community collaboration, and then there's the context. If you walk into any classroom today, you're going to see fundamentally a distribution of content. Content will be free. The technology is there already to deliver content to any. I've got programs in Africa where we're delivering the IB curriculum into kids sitting on dirt floors. Collaboration, that's Vygotsky's work, zone of proximal development. When I went to school, collaboration was called cheating. Every one of my projects was a single person project. It was never had the opportunity to learn from others. I think we'd all agree that that's got to be part of the pedagogy going forward. And then you've got to put that content in some relevant context, some challenge for the student. Otherwise, it's just fundamentally boring. And I think that's a big problem that we have. We lose the students on the top end, and we lose the students on the bottom end. And I think Todd in his book is really going to bring to light the fundamental flaw of that there is no one that's average. So I think it's Mike Markle used to ask me when we talked about big problems like this, how do you move a 20,000-pound marshmallow? You can push on it, you can do whatever. It's one bite at a time. Okay, and I think it's a big challenge. It's a cultural challenge. It's the change challenge, and I personally don't think the education is going to change from top down. I think it's going to change from bottom up, because I think when technology starts to deliver to the consumer, to the parent, an environment that allows us as parents to better understand our children. I've got my own Petri dish, 4 children and 15 grandchildren, right? One son who dropped out of school because he thought 3D, right? He was a kinetic visual learner. Well, there's no bigger impedance mismatch in our educational system than a kinetic visual learner. He ended up, graduating with honors as an architect and just won the Dwell Award, okay? And, we're talking about individuals. I mean, it's a stacked challenge, I think. And I agree with everybody here. Technology can't get in the way. It's got to really empower both the student and the teacher. And we've got to, I think we have to raise the value of a teacher in our society as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of challenges. And, I'm hoping with my book to sort of point out some of the challenges, but also some of the solutions, but directly to the parent.
John, you mentioned traveling around the world, and I know several others of you, certainly Anthony, I know you're all over the world all the time. Are there other parts of the world where the institutional education sector gets this better than here in the United States? Is there another part of the world where we're going to see sort of a leapfrog effect?
It's like someone said, we have lighthouses, but it's just not equally distributed. Right. There are parts that are sort of ahead, I think, and more in the challenge-based, challenge learning types of environments. But there's also, almost every place I go, there's a digital initiative at the government level, and normally that means a device and nothing more. And normally it means a device that's maybe manufactured even locally, so that their economy will build up. And unfortunately, the focus really isn't on the student. It's a political, and in some cases it's political. I'm running for office and I'm going to deliver this to the students. So it's a challenge, I think, worldwide.
Anthony, any perspective on that?
Yeah, it's the number one question I get asked from every education minister I meet with. What other countries are doing it better? It's an impossible question to answer because it's Mary and Jane and Avi that's doing it better, right? It's not. This doesn't scale to a country. The challenge, though, is the rhetoric is all the same. We're not talking about anything here that isn't being talked about in every continent on the planet, in the same level of everyone's desiring flipped classrooms and personalized learning, et cetera. What that actually means in a real way is often vastly different. They start with different infrastructures, different understanding from a teacher level, et cetera. The people change, the culture changes where it's all about. We have to get people to value a process for thinking about this transformation. We have this framework called 6I, which starts with introspection. What are we trying to do? Who are we trying to do it with? Investigation. What are the best practices available? Inclusion, where we ask other people what do they want, which we often learn is different than what we think. Innovation, where you actually then dream of what you can actually achieve, then implement, and then you get insight about what's happening and how do you make it better. We have a world where we focus on implementation constantly because we need to John's point, we need to show our voters what we're doing and take a photograph. So stuff that's easy to photograph is often what you value, even though that's not what's really driving the change. And schools constantly are implementing again and again and again. And I think the universal truth that all these countries who are having the nice sort of talking points of what they want is what is their aspiration and appetite for change in a big way. What I challenge the ministers is to think about change beyond their administration, which they often don't do, to build a legacy on something that's not tangible, which they don't want to do. They want to build a legacy on deploying devices or Wi-Fi ready their schools. The aspiration should be beyond the reach of what we can actually articulate and deliver. And that's the challenge that we often have to get. It's going to be people first, but it's also going to be bigger than what we think about. Why are we doing all of this? Why do we want personalized data, as I think Mike said or David said, is really the critical answer. It's not often being asked enough. Technology should be the answer to well-thought questions. Right now, what happens is a device goes into school and the questions come, but the questions are all in service of the device. If you think about it, if you just imagine dropping a device into a school, the question the teacher is going to ask is, how do I use it? How do I take all the books that I've had and lesson plans and move it to this? How do I keep my kids safe on this? How do I connect it to the projector, et cetera, et cetera? How do I pay for it when it breaks? But when you take this out and you say, what are the real questions we have on how do we help every kid? The answers are going to be far broader, and you may include technology as part of the tools to get there, but that conversation's harder. It's harder to photograph. It's harder to get a culture across, consistently across a country, at a scale of a country, to get ready for. And that's why I think a lot of the frustration exists around the pace of change. We're often focusing on the wrong thing.
I totally agree. So I want to come back to the topic that we sort of started with around personalization and the need to really individualize instruction. Because it strikes me, and I'm getting a little grumpy about it now, that between personalized learning and adaptive technology, I mean, these are the two hottest buzzwords in the industry. I can't, there's probably not one investor pitch in ed tech that doesn't use at least one of those, and usually both, several times on each slide. What do we actually, and then of course you've got Mark Zuckerberg, who's now made a personal commitment to investing significant personal wealth in personalization. And Eric, maybe I'll start with you. I'm curious, how do you define personalized learning, and how does that relate to adaptive learning? Because I think they get used interchangeably, and I think they're not interchangeable, right?
Sure. Yeah, I feel like a pincushion right now because I think of this as sort of like the definition wars, right? Every time you raise this sort of question, you get into an endless cyclical debate about these definitions, and to some degree, I'm not sure how productive those have been. That said, you asked me the question, I'll try to answer it.
Thank you, sir.
I do think that, I mean, inherently learning is personal, right? So we start from that perspective, and I guess that what we've done is we've built a bunch of teaching practices which inherently depersonalize that learning experience in varying degrees for very practical reasons, right? We might need large lectures, and that's hard to personalize in that milieu. So I tend to think about personalized learning as, first of all, an old thing. It's an old idea, right? And it's not a new idea.
You don't need technology to personalize.
You don't need technology to personalize. I remember my math cart, where I'd go up, I'd get the next laminated sheet, I'd work through it, and the teacher would circulate around the classroom, and everybody was in a different place, and the teacher was helping us with our problems. It was a very personalized learning experience, that math skills card, very low tech. I do think that, so I think we can think about personalization as a set of practices that enable a more personal learning experience, right? I can recognize that you need something different than you through many means, right? I do think, though, that we can start to layer technology into that. We can think about maybe what low-tech personalization, right? Just the idea of capturing video, lecture video, and putting some lessons together around it and pushing that outside the classroom with an expectation that you'll consume it away from here to free up more time for me to have some problem-based learning or activity-based learning when you are here is further personalizing learning, and that's a very low-tech approach. You can then start to think about higher-tech approaches to personalized learning. I would think about this maybe mostly in the world of data-informed learning, right? That's one of the big, powerful breakthroughs now is we can gather lots of data about what the learner's doing, how well they're doing it. We can apply cognitive models to that, and we can estimate where all the learners are. And that's a powerful idea now because I've raised insights that are very hard to get without that kind of technology and that kind of data. So now I can say these 17 students are actually sort of checking out. Engagement is declining. Something's wrong. Those 17 are working really hard. They're fully checked in, but they're each struggling with some different academic topics, and I can start to drive better and better interventions, right? But that's still enabling the human stakeholders to personalize the learning experience. So I think about personalized learning as these varying degrees of enabling the human stakeholders to personalize to these different techniques. I think about adaptive learning. I try to just keep this one really simple as what the software can do if no person did anything, right? So if the software can know something about the learner, it can estimate something about their learning state, and it can take an action to try to improve the learning state of that learner, i.e. deliver them some more practice, give them some feedback at the level of a step when they fail to solve that step accurately. Those kinds of things, that to me, that's adaptive. It's what the software can do without the people and everything else. So it's a subset of personalizing learning.
So let me ask a clarifying
Luyen,
question.
can I take
Oh,
a
sorry,
shot?
go ahead.
Yeah, no one is more annoyed at the bastardization of the term adaptive or personalized than probably we are. I mean, I think what we're seeing now is anyone who is selling or has a something that's beyond a PDF is calling it adaptive, and that is it's irresponsible.
Really makes one question the valuation you guys got in your last round, right? if whatever PDF is adaptive.
But in a PDF, you can
Well,
skip from page 1 to 3.
look, I
That's
think-
adaptive.
Look, Eric, the way you define adaptive, at a very simple level, that is absolutely, you can define it in that way, and I think that's what a lot of people are doing. But let me tell you guys what I think about, what is really adaptive, and whether, we call it adaptive being a subset, which I kind of do agree with that, Eric, it being a subset of personalized or individualized learning, and you're going to hear all these terms over and over again. I'm probably already sick of those terms, but what we think of when we think of adaptive is it's real science. It is a real practice. It takes real expertise and experience and large data sets. So I'm not going to get too technical with it, but let me just break it down in this way. You have to understand and have real data on content. You really have to have large and detailed understanding of how the content is working. Is it supposed to be teaching the instructional content that it was intended to teach? Is the assessment actually accurate in terms of assessing what it's supposed to assess? Can you calibrate that content at scale so that it is actually, you're putting the right thing in front of that student once you understand that state of that student? If you don't truly understand that kind of, at that level, data from that content, you're making guesses. It's no better than randomized recommendations. And people will call that adaptive because something's changing, so it must be adaptive. And that's, again, completely irresponsible. So understanding at a very granular level, if required, what that piece of content is supposed to be doing, and doing it at scale. I'm talking about millions of pieces of content and doing it in real time. On the other side of the equation, you really have to understand student proficiency. Student proficiency, again, is not guessing because they either got a question right or a question wrong, which is adaptive testing, which has been around for decades. It's actually understanding and being able to predict what that student and how that student is going to perform based upon what they've done and based upon that clean content that I just talked about before. And if you're understanding how well the student is performing against that piece of content, then you can actually begin to understand what that student needs to be able to move forward and deliver a superior outcome. That's all in the context of this teaching environment. So these are the tools, and I think Eric talked about this and a bunch of the other guys did talk about this, that can be leveraged at scale in classrooms. And we do talk about a lot about the blocking and tackling of this, but these things can be made very simply for instructors and for classrooms and institutions, and of course, most importantly for students. You don't need to know how the sausage is being made, but it is very important for people to understand what adaptive really is. It is absolutely data-driven. It is absolutely data-driven at scale, and you have to understand content and proficiency of students. And if you don't understand that, you can build any kind of recommendation engine you want. You'll be literally spitting out randomized answers, and that's completely irresponsible. Yeah. So what we're doing is, I think we need to do a better job. You talked about what are the big problems. We need to educate the industry. We need to educate this industry about what can be done, because I do believe that we've done a lot with what we've had. The industrial age, revolution and the education system that came about from that has created all of what we see around us today. It's been terrific. But it's not enough now where we're going as a species. And one of our investors, Peter Thiel, talked about some of the hard industries. And I think we should cut ourselves a little bit of a break, because he said that space travel and revolutionizing the auto industry is nothing compared to changing education. And we have to take that to heart. And but again, it is something that people need to understand. We have to do a better job of explaining it in terms that people can understand and absorb and then make useful.
Yeah. John, were you?
Well, when I was the CEO of a genomics company, we used technology to use the burn-in racks at Sun Systems to process all the data in the human genome with the idea that we would find a protein uniquely tailored to someone's DNA. And, and so I actually use the word precision pedagogy because I think there's a similar challenge that we're all addressing here, and is how do we deliver to that student at that time the right learning curve, which is within their flow, which is in their ability to do. And to me, it has less to do with distribution as it has to do with discovery. I think our education system is still a distribution system, and it needs to be a discovery system. E.O. Wilson, a teacher asked E.O. Wilson once at a meeting that I was at, what should I look for in my 8th grade student such that they would be a scientist? And his answer was really simple. He says, don't look for IQ, look for curiosity. And I think curiosity has been removed from our system. So I hope whatever technologies we have, adaptive or whatever, somehow allow for discovery and allow for curiosity.
It's such a great point that you're making. And what we found, and I think a lot of the guys on this panel have probably found this in their own businesses, is that unless you are able to solve some of the fundamental problems of struggling students, and even the kids who are doing well, they're just incredibly bored. If you're not solving that, the problem about discovering and your definition of learning versus kind of absorbing education, couldn't agree with you more. It is, you don't even get the right to begin to spend the time to tinker and to explore and to learn if you're struggling with the fundamentals. And that's what technology, that's what you can do with this to get people over that hump at a much more scalable, and it is like having a tutor. This stuff is not new. Technology makes it more scalable, but we need to apply it in the right way. When students have the ability to figure out what their problems are, they will figure it out, and there's nothing like figuring out that problem and then being able to apply it. And so we have to provide them with a more systematic way of being able to problem solve and get to that solution on their own. That's what technology, to me, enables. And if we can do that, people will soar. And it's not just about the bottom 10% and the top 10%. We've got a middle 80%, the silent majority, that we're just kicking down the road, kicking that can down the road every single year. And then we're surprised as to why they can't get jobs or why they've been told that they're absolutely prepared for higher education, and they're nowhere near being prepared. And these are people who are seemingly doing well.
So shifting gears for a second, but kind of related to all this, if personalized learning and adaptive technology are really kind of about precision pedagogy, I think, John, you said, and targeting and individualization. It's really about the small data, and it's about, understanding and about, related to a learner, or a learning object. Let's talk a little bit about the other side of it, which is the big data side of it, really interesting advances, obviously, in areas like cognitive computing, where we're able to use massive quantities of, semantic data to really have develop computers that have a transformative understanding of the domain that they are sort of interacting with. Mike and Anthony in particular, and obviously IBM and Microsoft have big initiatives in this domain. What do you see as the promise of big data and some of these new AI techniques around big data when it comes to education? Mike, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think following up with what David was talking about in this theme, I mean, in my view, all learning is personal, and it's engaging, and it's not just in the classroom. And I think when we talk about adaptive, there is this view that it's about the next best item in a curricular pathway for the student. But if you think truly about learning, it's everything from engagement in their community as a campus. It's the aspirations they create for a career or their future. So I come back to the P-TECH example with IBM. What was powerful there was all of that coming together for the kids that enrolled. They had a clear aspiration starting as freshmen in high school, and so that can be a personalized experience. So the opportunity with big data is using tools like Watson or cognitive tools, machine learning tools, where we can really begin to bring insight and value to different experiences with students to truly give them personalization at scale from a lot of different directions, and kind of connect them to the right people, the right mentors, the right opportunities to move themselves forward down that lifelong learning pathway.
Yeah, I think it's opening up opportunity. I think when you think about big data, AI, quantum computing, you're really opening up dimensions. Right now, traditionally, as we think about personalized or adaptive, it's often been hardwired scope and sequence. Now we're aspiring with some of the companies here to actually get beyond that. But really, we can get beyond it with multiple dimensions in terms of what time of day it is, what weather we have, what race a student is, that things can change with more inputs. And right now, we haven't been able to do that to scale without big data come to play with machine learning that can actually support much more not only adaptability or personalization, but actually coming in with multiple inputs in terms of behaviors, what's going on in the environment, and maybe changing content based on the aspiration of a student in terms of what they're looking for from a productivity perspective. The challenge with all of this is there's still far too much debate about all of this. What data should we collect? Who should own the data? Where should the data sit and be resident? What rights do we give to each of the vendors on this panel on what data they can have ownership on? Where do the data sit in silos? It's my data, it's not more data. This is the struggle, right. And until we get beyond this, and technology is not the issue, frankly. A lot of these things, machine learning, big data, it can do it. It's a cultural shift. It's a readiness shift. And I don't actually think that we're there by and large. And this is one of the things that while aspiration is real, technology can actually deliver. We've got to get ready. Once you start to think about quantum computing with big data driving insight, the question is going to be, who should own that insight? And do we want to give IBM or Microsoft the right to have that insight about my child? And we're not there yet. So I actually think we've got to do a lot of work on how do schools run more efficiently? How do they manage buses? How do they handle security? There's a lot of data and machine learning that can be applied on the operations of an institution. Build that foundation and trust there before we start working on the thing that's probably most precious to parents, and that's their children. And so obviously, I think that we're a lot of the promise of the technology is there, but I want us to put more rigor on things that I think will be less controversial to get a template and blueprint about actually how it can make the change. Because I think we're fighting ideology challenge, cultural challenge to get that transformation there. And big data opens up dimension. It opens up debate as well.
Well, it comes back a little bit to David's point about, maybe we haven't done a good enough job explaining what it is that we are trying to achieve, right? That, we're willing to give data that we would never give to anyone, that we met on the street, to Amazon or to Google, to Facebook, but that's because there's a very clear value proposition to us as consumers, right? And, what can we do to do a better job at actually describing to schools, to the education field as a whole, what the value proposition is ultimately, so that that this becomes less of an issue?
So I think there's a lot of things we could do. So hopefully other people will add some others. I thought Mike and I were at a dinner last night, and I think there was an interesting conversation that addresses one part of that, which is really probably the policy part of that, right? But it is true, I think, that if you think about data, and particularly in K-12 right now, that it's a bad word. Right. Someone used the expression, it's a 4-letter word, right? And was that you? Yeah. I thought it was great, right?
I'm going to use that, Mike.
Yeah, data's a 4-letter.
I'm writing an article on this.
And why is that? Well, it's because the policies that we've implemented have really emphasized summative data, right? And it's emphasized summative data for punitive purposes, or at least. And I'm not pessimistic about this. I think there's a lot of good things that have been done and good intent and meaning behind them. But by and large, we've reached a place where it's almost getting, like we can't pull it back, right? Because it's a 4-letter word, because it's been summative in nature and punitive in application, as opposed to formative in nature and transformational in application. Right. Teachers would love to know certain things. Parents would love to know certain things. Children, students, learners would love to know certain things about their own performance and how to get better at it. And if it was formative and it was building blocks of everybody doing better, then we'd have a very different conversation going on. But we started from the wrong place, and I think we have to walk some of that back if we're going to get to a better place.
The point was we really led with the stick. We have bad teachers, we have bad schools, we have to find them. And I think, if you think about healthcare, we started talking about how do we use tools like Watson to make the physician a better physician, give them a treatment recommendation, and help them understand why, what treatment and why, so that they could become better doctors. So I think we've got to begin to do that as well in education. And there is concern about how this data gets used from parents, understandably. So My view on this, though, is that the children today are going to grow up in a world where everything is monitored and measured. The Internet of Things is the new buzzword. So we're going to have cameras everywhere and sensors and everything. And so you're going to have all kinds of data being collected about you in 30 years' time. I think about my career. When I started, Apple and IBM were fighting mortal enemies over maybe, what, 500,000 units of PCs that were shipped in 1984. And a great Apple ad in 1984. And now 30 years later, Apple and IBM are partners, and there's like 2 billion units being shipped this year, right? So tremendous change. Think about 30 years and the kids growing up today, 30 years from now, who knows, 20 billion or more sensors collecting data. So they're going to live in a data economy. Our CEO refers to data as the next new natural resource. But from the individual perspective, if we're going to have a free and open society, they've got to be able to understand that. And I really think there is one of the things we don't talk enough about as an industry with educators is data citizenship. When we talk about digital citizenship and these things, I think it's a tremendous opportunity to start educating kids about data, their data, what's the exchange that they're making, and how can they become better citizens and better owners of their own data in this future world.
It was never possible for us to communicate the value proposition of owning your data and applying it in every future learning instance that you have as a student. And so our view is very simple on this. Students and parents, if you're under 18, own their data. We're custodians. Every one of us here are custodians of that data. And it is crazy to me in 2016 that if any of us go out and take a new course today, continuing education, master's degree, whatever it is, we enroll in a new school, they treat you as if you were a newborn baby from a data perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
We pretend that you spent 0 time in school. You pretend that we didn't know anything about you. You have no control over applying all of that hard work from again, from a proficiency standpoint, not socioeconomical, but proficiency standpoint, so that your learning and your success, your chances for success in whatever you're doing next are greatly enhanced.
You said 2 things, David, I think that are interesting is when we start all over again, so you do need to have persistence of this data to be able to do personalization at scale, and we need a way to do that. Second thing, so if you're under 18, you own the data. I don't know how I feel about my daughter when she leaves for college, suddenly now being fair game. So I think ultimately we need the regime where it really is your data. And last year, a similar panel like this, we had a superintendent at the end ask the question. I have legislators and parents asking me to manage their my students' data, their children's data, and yet teachers download apps in the classroom. I don't even know what happens. The data's out there. I have no tools, and they challenged us as a vendor community. What tools? How can I better manage this? So I think it's on some of us, especially those of us up here, to start giving those kind of tools to our clients.
So I think we're going to have to let Mike's word be the last word because I'm getting the high five sign here. But as you can tell, we could probably do this for the next 17 hours. I mean, maybe we should just take the show on the road, right? Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the panelists today.